Arguably, the more interesting conversation is not so much on those minimum requirements, but rather on the different ways in which you can actually get a copy of Windows Server 2016 installed onto a piece of hardware, and really also then how you manage that over time. There are three major installation options here with this version of the operating system. Starting first with the Server Core implementation. The one that I told you is Microsoft's target destination for where your server workloads ultimately are intended to go. If you haven't spent much time yet with the Server Core instance there in Windows Server 2012 R2, you might not be aware that Server Core itself is intended to be a small footprint, really headless operating system that removes the desktop user interface and runs only a minimal set of code. The idea being here with Server Core is that smaller amounts of code, less functionality, provides a smaller surface area for potential would-be attackers. It also requires fewer resources in order to run the operating system itself. And so Server Core is much more capable of getting Windows out of the way and running the workloads that you're really interested in working with. Now, Server Core, in order to do that, doesn't have that graphical UI. It really only includes a very limited set of graphical tools. There on your Server Core instance, you'll see things like Task Manager. You'll see things like Windows PowerShell. You'll find just a couple of control panels there as well, like the time date control panel and a couple other ones that still exist. But for the most part, all the graphical UI information, all that stuff that you're used to thinking of with Windows has been removed there from your Server Core instances. The ways then in which you manage Server Core are either through PowerShell or the legacy command prompt, or in most situations remotely through your other tools that you have, like your remote server administration tools or Windows PowerShell there on your desktop. Now, Server Core, this is important here with this OS version. Server Core is to be used with the long-term service branch servicing model. This means that the rapid release branch, which we'll talk about here in just a second, is not really where Server Core is intended to be positioned. You install a copy of Server Core and tend to manage it more so like you managed your old versions of the operating systems, in that you'd update them on the regular cycle like you're used to working with. Now, whereas Server Core is indeed a small footprint and headless OS, it is no longer Microsoft's smallest footprint and most headless OS. That recognition goes here to Nano Server, which, as you can see here, is an extremely small footprint headless OS that's ideal for compatible services, containers, and microservices. The reality here with the immediate release of Server 2016, as we're talking about the filming here today, is that Nano Server is probably going to be useful for your future outlook, for services that you may end up crafting yourself inside your environment that are specifically designed to work with Nano Server. That's why we have the term compatible services here. It's not likely, at least in the near-term future, that you'll be installing regular legacy applications like you're used to working with in the full GUI version of Windows here onto your Nano Server instances. Nano Server provides a location for your developers to code those microservices, and also if they're working with containers as a container host. And so you may find yourself exploring Nano Server here in the immediate term, and then also preparing for its use much further down the line as you start working with solutions that are designed around the services that it provides. Now, Nano Server itself was designed for total remote management. This means that when you install Nano Server, as we'll discuss later on here in this course, you actually don't have really any kind of on-the-console itself management functionality. You will deploy each instance of Nano Server with all the information it needs to bootstrap itself into the environment and on the network, so that you can then complete its configuration there through remote tools like PowerShell, server management, or remote MMC or System Center consoles. And so, as we'll discuss later on as we get into the implementation of Nano Server, that deployment has to include all the necessary stuff that the Nano Server needs, even to be able to then further connect to it once it's completed its installation. The other important bit here, and this is different from what we talked about with Server Core, is that in order to use Nano Server, you will have to be an individual or organization that uses or works with software assurance. You will also have to use the current branch for business servicing model, which is very different from the traditional model that we're used to working with our Microsoft OSs. Microsoft will dictate updates that will be delivered down to Nano Server, and for that reason, you'll have to be prepared for an altogether different way in which those servers actually get updated over time. Nano Server, as I've said here already, is kind of a special use situation that we're likely to see more embrace of as more people start working towards and developing on the Windows Server 2016 operating system. Our third option here, our third installation option, is the Server with Desktop Experience, which, if you played with Windows Server in previous editions, you may note is curious that we're including this last. I've said already that Microsoft really wants the full GUI experience with Windows Server to be the instance that you drift towards not using anymore. This traditional graphical user interface that you're used to working with Windows is equivalent to the server with a GUI installation option in Server 2012 R2. But what's curious here in this implementation is that the server with desktop experience also includes the desktop experience feature that was a separate installation back in Server 2012 R2. Microsoft does this because it intends this use of the GUI for only legacy applications and also for the use with remote desktop services, with the latter of these two really being Microsoft's use case for why we're also including the desktop experience feature with the other graphical user interface pieces. Microsoft, as I said, wants you to use Server Core in every situation where it makes sense, but there are some legacy applications that still won't function on Server Core. And so this use of Server with Desktop Experience will be a decision point, a part of your deployment strategy in figuring out which of your applications will work with Server Core, as opposed to which will work here with this full graphical UI. Similar to Server Core, the Server with Desktop Experience uses the long-term service branch servicing model. And so just like your previous edition OSs, you'll be servicing those with the usual updates like you're used to working with.